Mike and Teresa had always been curious adventurers, enjoying long walks through the woods near their home. One crisp fall afternoon, they ventured further into the forest than usual, hoping to discover a new path or spot to explore. However, what they found that day was beyond anything they could have anticipated. A small old stone house hidden deep in the woods, far from any trail or road. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. There was no record of it, no mention of it in any hiking guides or historical documents. In fact, it felt like they had stumbled upon something no one else had ever seen before. Confused and intrigued, they approached the house cautiously. The stone walls appeared weathered by time, covered with ivy and moss. The roof had begun to sag in places, and the wooden door was slightly ajar, as if inviting them inside. Something about the place felt eerie, but neither Mike nor Teresa could resist the pull of the mystery. They had always prided themselves on uncovering forgotten places, so this discovery seemed like a treasure. However, their excitement quickly turned to unease as they stepped closer to the building. The air around the house felt strange, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. It was silent, too silent for a forest that normally teemed with life. Then from the direction of the house, they heard it, a low, unsettling sound. It was almost a hum, like something was alive inside, but hidden from view. Teresa froze, her eyes widening in fear as she looked at Mike. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mike nodded, his instincts kicking in. They had both spent hours in the woods, but nothing had ever felt like this. The sound seemed to come from inside the house, and the longer they stood there, the more unsettling it became. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, almost like something, or someone, was moving around in the shadows. Teresa, determined to understand what they were hearing, hesitated but then stepped forward. She reached toward the door and gently pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly, a sound that felt too loud in the oppressive silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but something else lingered, something metallic, sharp. As Teresa peered inside, she gasped and quickly stepped back, her face pale. "Mike, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice trembling. Mike rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. Teresa had found something inside the house, but what was it? His mind raced and his eyes darted around the clearing, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Together they entered the small house cautiously, the air inside heavy and still. The space was cramped, with only a few pieces of decaying furniture and old, faded paintings hanging crookedly on the walls. But it wasn't the house itself that had unnerved Teresa, it was what she had discovered on the floor. There, half hidden behind a chair, was something large and covered in a dusty cloth. Teresa moved slowly, her hand trembling as she pulled back the cloth. What they saw underneath made Mike's stomach drop. There, lying motionless, was a large wooden crate. The strange noise they had heard earlier seemed to come from it, but now it was silent. The crate was sealed shut with iron clasps, but the markings on the surface were disturbing, etched in an ancient script, almost like a warning. It looked like something had been locked away for years, perhaps longer. Mike's mind raced. What was inside the crate? And why had no one discovered it before? They had walked this part of the forest countless times and never noticed this house or anything unusual. He turned to Teresa, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's dangerous?" he asked. Before Teresa could respond, they both heard footsteps approaching outside. They spun around, startled, but when the door opened, it wasn't the local wildlife or anyone they expected. It was their friend Jonathan, who had been with them on some of their walks before. But today, he looked different. His face was unusually pale, his eyes darting nervously. "What's going on? You guys look like you've seen a ghost," Jonathan said, forcing a nervous laugh. Mike and Teresa exchanged a look of uncertainty. Jonathan had always been a bit of an outdoorsman, but something about him seemed off. Teresa's gut told her that something wasn't right. "Jonathan," Mike began, his voice shaky, "do you know anything about this house? It seems like no one knows it exists. None of the paths match up with the maps. Jonathan hesitated, his lips pressed tightly together as if he were weighing his words carefully. Then he nodded slowly. "I know more than I should," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "But there are things here in these woods, things that people shouldn't mess with." The air grew colder, and Mike felt a chill run down his spine. Jonathan's words only deepened the mystery surrounding the house, and the more he spoke, the more questions arose. The house, the crate, and now Jonathan's cryptic warnings. Mike and Teresa realized that what they had stumbled upon was far more than a simple abandoned structure in the woods. With the growing tension in the air, they didn't know what to do next. But they were certain of one thing. They had uncovered something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The mystery of the forest and its secrets had only just begun to unfold. Teresa couldn't shake the feeling that they might be trespassing in a restricted area of the wildlife sanctuary. But as they walked deeper into the woods, there were no signs or warnings to indicate they were off limits. Their phones showed no coverage, leaving them with no way to confirm their location. Despite the uncertainty, Jonathan seemed confident in the path he'd chosen, and Mike and Teresa followed him, trusting his instincts. As they ventured deeper, a growing sense of unease settled over Mike. The deeper they went, the more isolated they felt. The woods around them grew denser, the air thicker with silence. Teresa, too, started to feel the odd tension in the air. She pulled out her phone one more time, relieved to see that their location was correct. At least they were still heading in the right direction. But despite the reassurance, something about the woods still felt off. They pressed on, and soon they reached the heart of the nature reserve, where Jonathan's excitement was palpable. He picked up his pace, almost running ahead. Mike and Teresa, though still cautious, followed his lead. The deeper they ventured into the wilderness, the stranger the atmosphere became. Then, as they neared a clearing, Mike took a cautious step forward, only to suddenly stumble. His foot had caught on something hidden beneath the underbrush, and he fell hard onto the ground. "Mike, are you okay?" Teresa rushed to his side, helping him remove his boot. But as she did, she realized something unsettling. Jonathan, who had been ahead of them just moments before, was no longer in sight. He had disappeared. "Where did he go?" Teresa whispered, scanning the area. Mike squinted, noticing something in the distance. Through the trees, partially hidden by overgrown ivy, he spotted a small stone house. The structure looked abandoned, its weathered walls and collapsed roof covered in layers of green. Yet there was something curious about it. Why would anyone stretch wires around an old, seemingly deserted building? Or perhaps the house wasn't abandoned at all. Just as they began to process this new discovery, they heard something, a strange noise coming from the direction of the house. It sounded almost like rustling, followed by a faint clicking sound, as if something or someone was still inside. Teresa's pulse quickened. "We need to be careful," she whispered, her voice tense. Mike, now equally intrigued and cautious, approached the house slowly. The noise seemed to come from within, growing louder the closer they got. Teresa moved around to the side of the house and found a small window, just big enough to peer through. She knelt down to take a look inside. At first glance, the room appeared empty, dusty, old furniture, and a few forgotten relics scattered across the floor. But then she noticed something unusual. A small box sitting in the corner of the room, its wires snaking out and attaching to something unseen. It looked out of place in the otherwise decaying room. Teresa felt a strange unease, as if this box was not something she should be seeing. It wasn't dangerous, or so it seemed, but it was definitely odd. Just as she was about to call Mike over to take a look, Jonathan reappeared, his expression tense. "I saw something," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Over there, in the tree." Teresa's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Before she could stop him, Jonathan walked toward a nearby tree, where a small camera was mounted. It was one of those surveillance-style cameras, clearly placed there for a reason. Teresa's stomach dropped. "Jonathan, get away from that. We don't know who's watching us." Jonathan, undeterred, approached the camera with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. He reached out, tapping it gently. As he did, Teresa and Mike exchanged nervous glances. They were no longer just visitors in a quiet sanctuary. They were intruders in a strange, hidden world. Someone had been watching them, perhaps for a long time. The tension was palpable as the weight of the situation dawned on them. They were far from the beaten path, in a place that wasn't on any map, and now clearly under surveillance. Teresa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just an old house in the woods, it was something else entirely. The question that loomed over them now was, who had set this up? And why? With every step they took, the mystery deepened, and the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. As Jonathan turned back toward them, his face slightly pale, he muttered, "I think we've stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to find." Mike and Teresa didn't need any more words to understand the gravity of the situation. They hadn't just found an abandoned house in the woods. They had uncovered a hidden, carefully guarded secret. What would happen next? They didn't know, but they knew they were no longer alone in these woods. The tiny house's device continued blinking, and Teresa realized that they had likely triggered an alarm. Just as suddenly as it had started, the blinking stopped, and she heard distant footsteps approaching. Panic set in. She quickly rushed to Mike and Jonathan, urging them to move. 3 sets of footsteps were now growing louder, and without hesitation, the group took off into the woods. Jonathan, determined to uncover the mystery, grabbed the device and carried it with him. The device suddenly began to beep loudly again, and the sound only added to the tension. "Drop it, Jonathan," Mike yelled. "They can probably trace it." But Jonathan, stubborn and intent on figuring out what the device was, refused to listen. Teresa couldn't help but wonder if Jonathan had a secret agenda. Why was he so determined to hold on to it? Meanwhile, Teresa's mind raced. She wanted to know who was following them and why. But Mike was hesitant to leave her alone in the woods. He reluctantly agreed to follow her plan to find out. The tension escalated when, out of nowhere, 2 German shepherds appeared, barking and running towards them. Then, just as quickly, the dogs were whistled away, and a mysterious man emerged from the trees. The man seemed calm and not immediately threatening, but his presence was unnerving. Why was he following them? The dogs, now gone, had apparently picked up on their scent, and the man asked them what they were doing in the area. Mike, feeling a wave of relief, realized that the man only wanted to talk. It turned out that he was a ranger named Peter, and he had been investigating the activation of a device in this part of the forest. He had plenty of questions for the couple. Teresa and Mike explained their presence, revealing that they had discovered the small stone house and assuring Peter that they meant no harm. Peter asked about the device, and his curiosity seemed to grow when he learned that Jonathan had taken it. The ranger glanced toward the edge of the woods, where Jonathan was still visible, but it seemed unlikely that his dogs would be able to catch up with him. Peter invited them to his cabin to talk more. When they arrived, he told them that the house was under guard, though he wouldn't explain why. He mentioned that the house was part of an old, closed amusement park that he had been tasked with protecting. The device, a piece of expensive equipment, had been left behind by mistake, and he wanted it back. Though Mike and Teresa found Peter's story plausible, there was something in his demeanor that made them feel he wasn't being entirely honest. Meanwhile, Jonathan was still missing, and it was clear that he had taken the device with him, believing he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Teresa tried to call Jonathan, but he didn't answer. Frustrated, Mike couldn't understand why Jonathan had acted so recklessly and left them in the dark. Then, out of nowhere, they heard a voice. It was Jonathan, but to their surprise, he was empty-handed. He no longer had the device with him. Peter immediately demanded to know its whereabouts, but Jonathan refused to divulge anything. Finally, Peter seemed to relent and told them the full story. The device, he explained, had been left behind after he discovered a rare animal species in the area. Peter hadn't wanted anyone else to lay claim to his discovery, so he had left the device behind. Jonathan, disappointed, realized he hadn't found anything extraordinary after all. He apologized to Mike and Teresa for his actions. A few days later, to their surprise, they saw Peter in the local newspaper, along with a thank you note to Mike, Teresa, and Jonathan for their help. Peter's message revealed the truth about the rare animal and the lengths he had gone to protect it. Though the mystery had been solved, the strange encounter in the woods left them all with more questions than answers, and they couldn't help but wonder how much more of the forest's secrets had yet to be uncovered.